Corrupt cops celebrate in court, but panic when he reveals. He's a veteran. They thought it would be just another closed case, another black man in chains, another courtroom nodding along to a script already written. They had done this before, fabricated charges, buried the innocent, celebrated in the parking lot like justice was something they could rig, bottle, and sell. But this time, they picked the wrong man. Because I wasn't just another defendant waiting to be sentenced, I was the one they didn't see coming. I was the silence they mistook for fear. And what they didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, is that I walked into this trial not to survive it, but to end theirs. They always cheer too loudly when they think they've caught another of us. It's a sound I know well, forced laughter echoing off courthouse marble like the distant bark of a hunting dog. That morning, the courtroom was already buzzing, bloated with confidence. The air smelled like worn leather, powdered wigs, cheap cologne, and unchecked power. They had me in chains. They had their story. And they had a black man in an orange jumpsuit who wouldn't meet their eyes. But I met every gaze, one by one. My name is Isaac Delroy. I am 60 years old, born in Jackson, Mississippi. I've fought 2 wars, one overseas in the name of my country, and one right here, in silence, under the weight of its contradictions. They said I was a drug trafficker, said they caught me with a satchel full of cocaine on the edge of town. It was confirmed that the fingerprints matched, the video was clear, and the witnesses were credible. They said I was finished. But the real crime wasn't in what they accused me of. The real crime was how eager they were to believe it. The moment the sheriff read the charges, the courtroom exhaled, relieved, satisfied, comfortable. The jury glanced at me and had already reached a verdict. The press typed their headlines before opening statements. The prosecution smirked like a man closing a sale, and the arresting officers stood proud, like lions posing for a photograph beside their latest kill. They didn't know who I was. Not really. They didn't know I used to wear a uniform too, just not the one they respected, not the kind that gets saluted in this part of Mississippi. Mine came with sand, blood, and 20 years of silence in the name of something bigger than me. I fought for a country that never asked me if I felt like I belonged. I came home to a land that honored my service with closed doors and sideways glances. And yet, I still stood, still served, still watched. Because somewhere along the way, I realized the battle was never really over there. It was always here, in courtrooms like this, in towns like Greenville, with men who think power is license and black skin is guilt. They thought I was just another old fool, broken, tired, easy to crush, and I let them. I panted when they cuffed me. I bowed my head in the courtroom. I said yes, sir, and no, sir, with the smoothness of someone who's learned to make himself small to survive. Not because I was afraid, but because I was listening, watching, gathering. Every lie they told became another nail in their coffin. They said I resisted. I didn't. They said I confessed. I hadn't. They said the video showed everything. It showed nothing. They called me a monster. I smiled, because I knew something they didn't. They thought they had cornered a criminal. But what they'd done was stumble into the crosshairs of something they couldn't control. Truth, sharpened by silence. Justice, delayed but not denied. A man who had nothing left to lose, and everything to say. In every glance the prosecutor cast at the jury, I saw desperation pretending to be confidence. In every word the sheriff spoke, I heard fear disguised as authority. And in every inch of the courtroom, I smelled the decay of a story told too many times with too little consequence. This wasn't justice. It was a theater, and they had cast me as the villain long before they printed the playbill. But the truth doesn't need applause. It waits. It waited while they celebrated too soon. It stayed as they paraded their false evidence. It waited as I sat in silence, remembering every name, every face, every misstep. And when the moment came, it would walk in, not with noise, not with fury, but with precision, wrapped in a manila envelope and delivered by someone they thought had already been defeated. I wasn't broken. I was ready. They didn't know it yet, so as the bailiff called the courtroom to order and the judge took her seat, I stared down the men who thought they'd destroyed me. And I smiled, not because I had won, but because I knew what was coming. And deep down, so did they. Certainly, silence was my sharpest weapon. They thought I stayed quiet because I was scared. They were wrong. I shut my mouth because silence is a scalpel, not a surrender. The courtroom was a stage, and I had no intention of playing their script. Not yet. When you've lived long enough with a target on your back, you learn that sometimes the most brilliant move isn't to shout your innocence. It's to listen, closely, carefully, because lies echo louder when no one's interrupting them. So I let them speak. I let the prosecutor call me a parasite, a threat to society, a dealer poisoning the streets. I let the deputy testify with practiced ease, voice smooth like molasses over broken glass. I let the jurors look at me and see not a man, but a statistic. And I watched it all, like I'd watched sandstorms move across the desert when I was still in uniform, slow, inevitable, and blind. What none of them knew was that I was cataloging every word, every shift in tone, every nervous glance. I saw the DA tap his pen 3 times whenever he lied. I noticed how the sheriff clenched his jaw whenever someone mentioned camera. I watched a junior officer flinch slightly when my name was read aloud, like he knew something he wasn't supposed to. The truth is, the courtroom was never a trap for me. It was the trap for them. I had laid it myself. But to bait it properly, I had to let them think I was already bleeding. So, I gave them what they expected. I played the quiet, stoic black man. I was not angry or defensive, just still, like a stone, like a tombstone. Let them write their names on my silence. Because what they never learned to fear was a man who doesn't need to be loud to be dangerous. On the first day, the public defender assigned to me, Rebecca, tried to discuss strategy. Her voice was soft, trained, and a little too polished for this part of Mississippi. She assumed I was scared. I didn't blame her. Her eyes still shone with the glow of someone who believed the system could be saved. "You need to speak, Mr. Delroy," she said. "Jurors need to hear from you. Humanize yourself." I almost smiled. For me, she didn't know that being human had always been a liability. "Not yet," I told her. She frowned, confused, but she didn't press. Smart girl. They tried to break me more than once. The holding cell was cold, deliberately so. I knew that trick. You let the chill seep into a man's bones long enough, and he'll start talking to feel warm again. But they didn't know me. Cold is where I was born. My mama used to say, "The South doesn't just raise you, baby. It carves you out." And Lord, wasn't she right. The trial dragged on daily, and I sat through it like a stone under the rain, watching, recording, and letting them bury themselves in their certainty. What they didn't understand, and what terrified them most once they began to suspect, was that I wasn't here by mistake. I didn't get caught. I walked into this fire because I knew what they'd do. I'd studied men like them for decades, Men who mistook authority for wisdom. Men who planted evidence like they were sowing crops. Men who drank bourbon at night and laughed about the lives they'd rearranged. You don't fight men like that by swinging wildly. You cut at the roots, slowly, precisely. And that's what I was doing. Every second, I kept still. Every second, I didn't beg. Every second, I didn't react as they expected. I pulled them closer to the truth, one invisible thread at a time. They thought they were in control, but they were puppets dancing on strings I'd been weaving long before they ever laid eyes on me. And when the final day came, I finally looked the prosecutor in the eye and tilted my head just slightly, as if to say, "Now." That was when he blinked. That was when his hand trembled for the first time as he reached for a file he thought was airtight. He didn't know I had already read it. He didn't know what was coming next. But I did, and so I waited silently like thunder hiding behind the sky. Because sometimes the loudest sound a man can make is the one he doesn't, not until it's too late. The room cracked open in silence the moment I rose. It wasn't loud, and there was no gavel, slamming, or shouting. Just a shift, like the air itself had realized it had been breathing in a lie too long. The judge adjusted her glasses, not expecting the defendant to rise before being called. The prosecutor paused mid-sentence. Even the ceiling fan, ancient and sputtering above us, seemed to slow for a moment, like it too was listening. "I'd like to address the court," I said. No one moved at first. I was still in shackles. My hands, bruised and marked from 4 days of tight steel. My clothes, the standard issue orange that makes everyone look guilty, no matter what their mouth says. But my voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise. It was quiet, firm, as if the earth had steadied beneath my feet for this moment. The judge blinked, uncertain. The prosecutor scoffed and leaned toward his microphone. "Your Honor, the defendant has waived his right to testify." "I didn't waive anything," I interrupted, calm as Sunday rain. I remained silent. "There's a difference." The judge nodded once, slowly. "Proceed." I turned to the jury. 12 faces, pale, tired, confident. They had been told who I was. A dealer, a liar, a danger, a name on a file with enough weight to bury me alive. "My name is Isaac Delroy," I said. "I'm 61 years old. I served 23 years in the United States Army, including 2 combat tours overseas. I have never been convicted of a crime, and for the past 14 months, I have worked as a special agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Gasps scattered like wind through tall grass. A pen dropped. A woman in the back row muttered something under her breath. The sheriff, seated just 2 rows behind the prosecution, stiffened so hard I could hear the leather of his belt squeak. No one looked sure of anything for the first time in this trial. I came to this town because we received multiple reports of systemic corruption within the Talbot County Sheriff's Department. Reports of planted evidence, coerced confessions, and fabricated charges, especially targeting young black men and women. We needed proof, real proof. So I offered myself. I let the silence hold for a moment longer. Let the weight of what I'd just said reach the floor, then rise. I allowed myself to be arrested. I allowed the system to chew on my name, my dignity, my face. Because I needed to see it from the inside, I needed to know how easily it could happen. And it did. It happened just like the reports said it would. The prosecutor was pale now. He reached for a folder but didn't open it, and his fingers shook. "I was stopped without probable cause," I continued. "My prints were lifted and placed on evidence I never touched. Witnesses were paid or threatened. And all of it, every word, every file, every step, was documented." I nodded toward the bailiff. Your Honor, with your permission, I request to submit into evidence a sealed report from the FBI's Office of Internal Affairs. It includes hidden surveillance footage, audio transcripts, and corroborating statements from multiple victims whose voices were never heard in this courtroom. The judge stared at me, then at the bailiff, and finally nodded. Submit it. The moment those documents left my hands, the whole room changed. The jury shifted in their seats, no longer leaning back or so sure. The press in the gallery raised their cameras. The sheriff tried to rise from his seat, but two men in suits moved from the back of the courtroom, calmly but firmly asking him to remain still. You built your case on a lie, I said, this time facing the prosecutor. And now it's collapsing, not because of a dramatic twist, but because the truth, when patient, becomes undeniable. He opened his mouth. No words came out. I looked back at the jury one last time. I wasn't the one on trial this week, I said. You just didn't know it. Then I sat down. And for the first time since the trial began, no one spoke. Because justice doesn't always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it walks in dressed as the accused. Sometimes it waits inside a man you thought you'd already broken. And when it speaks, the guilty remember how to be afraid. No one expects the evidence to walk into the courtroom on its own 2 feet. They expected a man who begged, who broke, who tried to bargain his way into mercy. They expected someone who'd fold under pressure, who would crack after enough hours in a cold cell and too many whispers about how long prison time feels when no one remembers your name. But I wasn't made of the kind of silence they were used to. Mine was deliberate, dangerous. It had weight. So when I stood again, after already shaking the foundation of the courtroom with who I truly was, I didn't speak like a man trying to prove himself innocent. I spoke like a man preparing to unearth a system that had long mistaken darkness for safety. The judge gave me the floor. I turned toward the bailiff and said, "Bring in the case file, box 17. A simple request. But the reaction? A ripple. The DA shifted in his seat. One of the junior officers standing at the back cleared his throat and looked to the sheriff, who didn't look back. The box wasn't large, just standard cardboard, but it carried more weight than anyone in that room could have imagined. As it was placed on the witness stand, I sensed a change in the energy. You could feel it in the air. Something thick, sharp, almost metallic, like the moment right before a thunderstorm tears the sky open. Every eye in the room locked on that box, as if it might open itself and speak. It didn't. I did. In this box, I said, are 15 months of documentation, over 60 hours of audio surveillance, video footage from body cams that were never reported, phone logs and chain of custody reports mysteriously missing from the public record. Affidavits were provided by officers who left this department when they realized what they were being asked to do, and statements from 6 individuals who were falsely imprisoned due to fabricated evidence, 2 of whom are still behind bars today. There was no sound. I continued. Every report here was collected legally, through channels authorized by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Each document has been verified. Each recording is time-stamped and cross-checked. There is no speculation here, only facts. I opened the lid slowly, not for drama, but because the moment deserved reverence. I lifted the first file and handed it to the clerk, then the second, and then the third. And still, no one moved. The DA's face was frozen. The sheriff's fists were white-knuckled. The jury sat stiff, eyes wide, not blinking. You want specifics? I asked, turning now to the people in that room who had whispered and chuckled when they thought they had me chained and silenced. Page 47, Exhibit B. A recorded conversation between Deputy Miller and Officer Harlan, discussing how to salt a crime scene with planted cocaine before the press arrived. Time-stamped. Verified. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth. Page 92, Exhibit G. Body cam footage, scrubbed from the station's internal system, but archived in our federal servers. It shows a suspect being coerced into signing a false confession under threat of violence. The judge leaned forward. And finally, Exhibit M, my arrest footage. Not the edited version submitted to court, but the raw file. It shows me being stopped without cause, the officer stating on record that he had been given orders from higher up to ensure I didn't leave town clean. I let that one sink in. Then I looked at the jury. These aren't mistakes. They're not procedural errors or clerical oversights. They're patterns, intentional, rehearsed, executed. And everyone who had their hands on the wheel of this machine, every man who smiled while the system rolled forward, has their fingerprints in this box. No one interrupted. No one could. Because what had once looked like a trial was now an exorcism. The room wasn't quiet. It was suffocating itself, holding its breath in the face of something it could no longer deny. And in that suspended second, when every lie hung by a thread, I said the one thing none of them were ready to hear. The question isn't whether you believe me, I said. The question is, how long have you known and chosen not to look? Then I stepped back, and the silence didn't break. It shattered. The moment the final exhibit was submitted, the courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't gasp. It did something far worse. It stopped like a heart suddenly forgetting how to beat. I could feel it. A shift. An unraveling. Every pillar of control, the sheriff's calm, the DA's posture, even the judge's carefully guarded expression, began to warp under the pressure of truth made visible. The truth doesn't kick down doors. It creeps in through the cracks, invisible at first, until it becomes unbearable. And by then, it's too late. I sat down slowly, not in triumph, but in stillness. I didn't need to perform. I had already spoken. The documents were out. The recordings had been heard. The jurors, previously relaxed, were now sure, now clutched their pens like lifelines. Their eyes darted to the box on the table, then to each other, then back to me. The judge called for a brief recess, her voice more strained than before. But no one moved. It was as if standing might make them part of what was happening, as if acknowledging it might make it real. And then, movement. Two men entered from the rear doors. Federal. Not loud, not aggressive, but with that deliberate stillness that announces power more effectively than shouting ever could. The courtroom doors closed behind them with a finality that made everyone flinch. They didn't look at me. They walked straight toward the sheriff. For a split second, he didn't move. As if he thought, maybe hoped, they were coming for someone else. Then his face shifted, just slightly. The kind of shift you only see in men who've spent a lifetime convincing themselves they'd never be caught. A flicker of disbelief, then rage. "On what grounds?" he asked, standing abruptly. The taller agent didn't flinch. "Federal charges, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, civil rights violations, wire fraud, and we have a sealed indictment for conspiracy under Title 18. The sheriff laughed, short, bitter. He looked at the judge, the DA, then the gallery, as if anyone might still be on his side. But the air had turned. The silence had grown teeth. "Don't touch me!" he barked, as the agents moved closer. But they didn't hesitate. The cuffs came out. Not rushed, not showy, just final. Cold steel over warm skin. A click that rang out louder than any gavel. He fought for just a moment. Then he didn't. And then, another shift. The DA, who had so far remained seated, slowly stood, his hands raised half-heartedly. "I wasn't aware of any of this," he said, his voice quieter. I was given files. I didn't—" His words trailed off, unfinished. The second agent didn't respond. He just reached into his coat pocket and produced a smaller envelope, quietly, calmly. "Mr. Lattimore," he said, "you've been named in 3 separate witness testimonies. Your signature appears on 4 redacted case files that have now been proven to be falsified. You're coming with us." The prosecutor's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His knees buckled slightly, and he leaned on the table like it might save him from drowning. They cuffed him, too. The room remained breathless. Somewhere in the back, a woman began to cry. Not loudly, not out of shock, but like someone who had waited years for something she never thought would arrive. The judge finally spoke. "This court is adjourned," she said, her voice cracking once. But no one left. Not yet. Because what they had witnessed wasn't just a takedown, it was an unmasking. A carefully constructed system around fear and performance had been gutted from within, not by a mob, not by violence, but by documents, tape, and facts no one wanted to believe until they couldn't ignore them anymore. I didn't stand. I stayed seated. Not because I was tired, but because I knew what they were seeing now wasn't just a courtroom. It was a mirror. The chains that had bound me 3 days ago were gone, but the real, invisible ones were still clamped around this town's throat. For the first time, someone had successfully picked the lock. And somewhere deep inside, every person in that room had to ask themselves the same quiet question. How long had they known? And how long had they looked away? I didn't need to say anything else. The truth had already spoken. Power has a smell, not just the cologne of men in pressed uniforms or the sharp tang of polished courtrooms. Real power carries the scent of fear, wearing confidence like a cheap aftershave. That's what I learned sitting across from them, day after day, watching the men who swore to uphold the law slowly crumble beneath the weight of their arrogance. They didn't fall all at once. No, that would have been too easy. They unraveled slowly, first in their eyes, then in the cracks of their voices, and finally in the silence between their words, the silence I had studied, nurtured, and weaponized. I didn't raise my voice because I didn't fight them as they expected. I didn't throw chairs. I didn't demand justice with a fist in the air. I let them build the walls of their guilt. And when they stepped inside, I quietly locked the door behind them. They thought restraint was weakness. They mistook stillness for surrender. But there's a kind of patience that only comes from having nothing left to prove. When you've already survived being invisible in a system designed to erase you, you don't rush your revenge. You serve it slowly, cold, measured. The sheriff, now in cuffs, sat slumped like a deflated myth. The prosecutor, who once paraded falsehoods like gospel, refused to meet anyone's eyes, and the courtroom that had laughed when I was brought in, chained, tired, and presumed guilty, now stared at me with a mixture of shame and awe. They couldn't understand that this moment wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving that the truth will find its way to the surface no matter how long it's buried. And when it does, it doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand. I had stood. Not once in this entire trial did I let them see my rage. Not because I didn't have any, but because rage is loud, and I needed quiet. I needed them to be relaxed, comfortable, overconfident. I needed them to believe they'd won until the moment the floor gave out beneath them. And when it did, God, it was quiet. Not a single scream. No protests. Just the unmistakable sound of justice reclaiming its voice. The people in the gallery leaned forward as if gravity had changed direction. Reporters, once skeptical, were now scribbling down everything as if it was scripture. The judge, composed but cracked, nodded. There was nothing left to say, no rules to twist, no evidence to manipulate. Everything they had built was burning. All I had done was hand them the match. And still, I didn't celebrate. Because this wasn't a parade, it was a reckoning. Somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't just about me. I had become the vessel for something older, something angrier, something tired of being ignored. Every time they mocked me, they mocked the lives they had stolen before me. Every time they lied, they dishonored the truths they buried. And now, those truths were no longer ghosts. They had names, faces, files, and voices, and I carried them with me. As I walked out of the courthouse, the sun hit differently. It was not warmer or brighter, just clearer, like something had been scrubbed clean from the sky. People didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Their silence said more. Heads nodded. Eyes met mine and held, no longer with pity, but with recognition, as if they had finally seen the man behind the label. Like they understood, maybe for the first time, that dignity doesn't beg. It endures. That day, they didn't just see me win a case. They saw me win a case. They saw me outthink an empire. And the ones who once thought they were above the law, they weren't just proven wrong. They were exposed, completely, methodically, irrevocably. And I walked, not faster, not taller, just free. Because real justice doesn't explode, it uncoils, and when it does, it leaves nothing untouched. Justice didn't end in that room. It just woke up. The chains had been gone for hours, but my wrists still remembered them. There's a strange quiet that follows a courtroom storm. Not the hush of respect, not the silence of defeat. It's something more profound, older. Like the earth itself, it is exhaling after holding its breath for too long. That was the feeling as I walked out of the courthouse, not victorious, not vindicated, but changed. Freedom didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a question. What now? The agents, the judge, the press, they had done their part. Names had been taken, files exposed. Men who once ruled by fear were now learning the sound of a jail cell locking from the inside. But something colder remained beneath all that justice, the concrete and the ceremony. A whisper. How many others? How many names had never made it to a folder? How many stories never reached a courtroom? How many truths died in silence because no one was listening? Or worse, because someone was. The question followed me down the courthouse steps, across the cracked sidewalks of a town built on polite lies and quiet violence. It echoed louder with each nod from the crowd. Each handshake lingered too long. Each "thank you" was spoken in a voice that carried gratitude and guilt. I didn't have answers, only memories. Memories of men I'd met in holding cells who didn't know their rights and never would. Of mothers who cried behind tinted glass, whispering prayers for sons already sentenced. Of officers who wore their badges like shields, not of service, but of ego. And of one old veteran who walked into the fire, not because he believed the system would protect him, but because someone had to prove it could still burn. That part is over now. The story is told, the box is open, the files are public, and the men who thought their uniforms made them untouchable are no longer standing. But if that's all it is, a story, a moment, then we've learned nothing. Because justice doesn't live in courtrooms, it doesn't sleep in files. It breathes through vigilance. It survives in people who refuse to look away. Those who question the version of truth are most easily accepted. It thrives not in grand acts, but small ones. The teacher who tells the truth in history class, the juror who refuses to convict without cause, the officer who reports a partner instead of covering up a crime. That's the real war, not the one I fought overseas, not even the one I fought inside that courthouse. The real battle is fought quietly, day by day, against the erosion of empathy. And the enemy is apathy dressed as order. I won. But I didn't come to win. I came to watch them reveal themselves. They did. And now, what you do with that truth, that's not on me. It's on you. Because this country doesn't need more heroes, it needs witnesses. Brave ones, loud ones, quiet ones, persistent ones. So if you're listening, don't ask what happened to me. Ask what happens next. And ask it every time you see a story that doesn't make sense. Every time a man is silenced too quickly. Every time a woman's scream gets lost in legal language. Every time the system promises justice but delivers silence. Ask. Because questions are how the truth breathes. And I promise you, if we ever stop asking, justice will fall asleep again. Just like it did before I walked into that courtroom. Ultimately, the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to last longer than the lie. Those who abused their power, who twisted the law for personal gain, thought they were untouchable. But no uniform, title, or courtroom trick could save them from the weight of their corruption. They lost everything: reputation, career, and the illusion of control. That's the price of building power on the backs of the innocent. And it always comes due. Let this be your reminder. Doing what's right may cost you comfort, but doing what's wrong will cost you everything. If this story stirred something in you, leave a comment below. Please share this with someone who believes power makes them immune to consequences. And don't forget to subscribe for more interesting videos.